Our journey today begins on the English coast, in a quiet seaside town in January 1915. Here, in the idyllic resort of Great Yarmouth, on the Norfolk shore, the Great War, which began in August 1914, has felt very far away. Life carries on as it always has. Fishermen mend their nets, children sleep in narrow beds, the gas lamps burn faintly in the streets. But the 19th of January would not be an ordinary night. For the first time in British history, war would come to civilians, not through soldiers storming the town on foot, nor by cannon from a warship offshore, but by something new, almost alien. It would come from the air. Within the moonlight, a vast silver shadow glides. Silent as a phantom, it drifts slowly over the rooftops, engines murmuring, like distant bees. Silent enough not to wake the sleeping victims, and high enough to remain unseen in the dark. And then, from its belly, the first bombs fall. Explosions tear through the night. Fire and smoke bloom where moments before there had only been sleep. The Zeppelin, having released its murderous payload, drifts away, leaving behind fire, terror, and disbelief. A new age has begun, one in which civilians must watch the skies, black out their windows, and seek shelter from death from above. From 1915 onward, mankind had learned a dreadful truth. The skies could now bring war to every home. And yet, the machine that first delivered this terror was not born only from destruction. It was a marvel, a technology that once promised a new world, and one that today is almost forgotten. But what exactly was this strange visitor in the night sky? The Zeppelin was no ordinary balloon. It was the creation of Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin, a former German general turned dreamer. At the dawn of the 20th century, he imagined vast ships of the air, rigid giants with a skeleton of aluminium covered in fabric and filled with gas cells that gave them lift. Inside their gondolas, engines drove propellers, and steering fins guided their course. They were unlike anything the world had seen before. Not fragile balloons drifting with the wind, but leviathans that could travel for days, directed like ocean liners across the sky. The first of these airships took flight in 1900, and within a decade the Zeppelin company had created a fleet, and Germany had embraced them as a symbol of modern power. Before the war, they carried passengers in luxury, gliding above cities and countryside in serene silence, a vision of a new age of travel. But with the coming of the war in 1914, their purpose changed. Now the Zeppelins belonged to the Kaiser's navy. No longer liners of peace, they became weapons of war. They scouted the North Sea, patrolled for enemy ships, and, most chillingly of all, they became bombers. Between 1915 and 1917, more than 50 Zeppelin raids struck Britain. They came gliding over the Norfolk coast, over the darkened streets of London, over the industrial towns of the Midlands, and up north into Scotland. The very first came on the 19th of January 1915, when two airships, L3 and L4, crossed the North Sea. They bombed Great Yarmouth and King's Lynn, killing 4 people, the first civilians in Britain ever to die by air attack. The shock only grew as the raids continued. On the 31st of May 1915, Zeppelin LZ-38 drifted across London itself. Bombs fell on Aldgate, Stepney, Stoke Newington. 7 people were killed, and 35 were injured. Panic rippled throughout the capital as, if the heart of the empire itself was not safe, well then, nowhere was. Through 1915 and 1916, the Zeppelins kept coming. Norwich, Hull, Hartlepool, the Midlands, even Edinburgh. All were struck. It is thought that there were 52 raids over Britain, and by the end of 1916, over 500 civilians were dead, and more than 1,000 were injured. The Zeppelin had announced itself as a technological force to be feared and respected. And yet, the terror of the Zeppelin was more than just numbers. They were vast, silent, and to many, almost supernatural. Newspapers called them phantoms and monsters of the air. Searchlights raked the night skies, anti-aircraft guns pounded away, and at first it seemed that nothing could touch them. Again and again, the Silver Giants drifted home to Germany, battle-scarred, but unbroken. But why were these giants of the air so difficult to stop? At first glance, the Zeppelin seemed fragile, a balloon, surely easily destroyed, and yet for a time they moved across Britain almost with impunity. Part of the answer lay in their altitude. Zeppelins could climb to more than 10,000 feet, higher than most British aircraft of 1915 could reach. Pilots in frail biplanes grasped for air as they struggled to climb into the darkness, only to find the Phantom still above them. The anti-aircraft guns of the time weren't much better. Their shells burst far below the raiders, or fell harmlessly back to Earth. Londoners joked grimly that the gunners were more dangerous to their own rooftops than to the enemy. And even when bullets did strike, they were not enough. The Zeppelin was a Leviathan with many gas cells. A bullet hole in one cell meant nothing. The others held the ship aloft. Hydrogen escaped silently into the night without fire, and unless the gas could be ignited, the Silver Giant simply drifted away, battered, but alive. For a time, the Zeppelin was more than a machine. It was a spectre, appearing when it chose, leaving when it willed. No defense seemed to matter. But that would change. The turning point in the Zeppelin War came in September 1916. By then, the raids had been terrorizing Britain for more than a year. But with the development of a new weapon for the biplane, incendiary and explosive bullets, designed not only to pierce the gas cells, but to ignite the hydrogen within, the giants of the sky could, at last, be set alight. On the 3rd of September 1916, the airship SL-11 was intercepted and set ablaze over Hertfordshire. Its fiery fall was visible for miles around, and it marked a profound change. The Phantoms were no longer invincible. Over the following months, more Zeppelins met the same fate. Searchlights, anti-aircraft guns, and fighters armed with incendiaries took a heavy toll. By the end of 1916, the Zeppelin was no longer a weapon of terror. It was a target, and their losses began to outweigh their successes. The raids did not cease immediately. Attacks continued into 1917, and even as late as 1918, Zeppelins flew missions over Britain. But the great fear of 1915 had passed. Once seen as unstoppable, the airships were now recognized as fragile giants, spectacular in their destruction, and no longer decisive in the war. From that point on, the Zeppelin as a weapon was in decline. They would never again hold the night in quite the same way. The Zeppelin War had ended not in triumph, but in fire. By 1918, more than half of all airships launched against Britain had been destroyed. They had proven too slow, too vulnerable, and too costly to serve as true weapons of war. And yet, their story did not end with the armistice. For their failures as bombers, the Zeppelins had revealed something extraordinary. The skies could be crossed, not in fragile biplanes, but in great liners of the air. The same machines that once dropped bombs over Great Yarmouth and London would be repurposed to carry passengers across oceans, offering dining rooms, cabins, and champagne breakfasts high above the clouds. The age of terror was over, and an age of absolute wonder was about to begin. In the 1920s, the Zeppelin Company returned to its original purpose: passenger travel. Airships offered something no aeroplane of the time could: long-range comfort and endurance. Where biplanes were cramped and short-ranged, the Zeppelin could cross oceans and remain aloft for days. The most successful of these new vessels was the Graf Zeppelin LZ-127, which was launched in 1928. Over the next 9 years, she flew more than 1 million miles, including 590 flights and 144 ocean crossings. Inside, the Graf Zeppelin offered simple but comfortable accommodation. Passenger cabins with bunks, a lounge with windows overlooking the clouds, and a dining room where meals were served on porcelain with silver cutlery. Travellers could dine, converse, and sleep as the ship drifted steadily across the Atlantic. Unlike the turbulence of aircraft or the rolling of ocean liners, the Zeppelin drifted smoothly with the air, often described as gliding in stillness. Passenger capacity was limited, meaning travel on the Graf Zeppelin was mostly an experience for the elite. On short excursions within Germany or to neighbouring countries, the Graf Zeppelin could carry around 35 passengers, whilst for transatlantic crossings, where weight and fuel were critical, this was reduced to around 20, and the cost of a ticket was several times that of an ocean liner crossing. This regular transatlantic service was the Graf Zeppelin's greatest achievement, and she maintained it throughout the early 1930s. Her home port was Friedrichshafen, on Lake Constance in southern Germany. From here she would fly north over Europe, cross the Atlantic via Spain or West Africa, and continue on to Recife and Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Later she also linked Germany to the United States, mooring at Lakehurst, New Jersey. A typical crossing from Europe to South America took about 3 to 4 days. The Atlantic to the United States could be done in a similar time span, sometimes under 3 days with favourable winds. By comparison, the fastest ocean liners of the day, like the Mauretania or the Normandy, took 5 to 7 days to make the same journey. The Zeppelin was not only faster, but it carried passengers in an environment of silence and stability. These crossings made the Graf Zeppelin the first true long-range passenger aircraft in history. In an age when most airplanes could only carry a handful of people across short distances, she carried dozens across oceans with ease. The liner of the sea had found its rival, the quiet liner of the sky. As early as August 1929, the Graf Zeppelin undertook the first successful round-the-world flight by airship. The journey was organized with the financial support of the American newspaper publisher, William Randolph Hearst, who required that the circumnavigation begin and end in the United States. The airship departed from Lakehurst, New Jersey, on the 8th of August, and from there it crossed the Atlantic to Friedrichshafen. The second leg carried it across Europe, Russia, and Siberia to Tokyo, a distance of nearly 7,000 miles. The third stage was the most dramatic, a 5,998-mile non-stop crossing of the Pacific Ocean from Tokyo to Los Angeles, completed in just under 4 days of continuous flight. The final leg carried the ship across the continental United States back to Lakehurst. In total, the Graf Zeppelin flew 21,500 miles, 34,600 kilometers, in little over 21 days of flight time, completing the circumnavigation in under a month. The significance of this achievement is best understood in comparison with contemporary aircraft. In 1929, long-range fixed-wing airplanes were still experimental. Charles Lindbergh's transatlantic solo flight of 1927 was hailed as an extraordinary feat, but it was barely 3,600 miles. No airplane of the day could cross the Pacific at all, and passenger aircraft were limited to short regional flights, often with frequent fuel stops, and carrying only a handful of people in cramped conditions. By contrast, the Graf Zeppelin carried dozens of passengers and crew in relative comfort, with lounges, bunks, and a dining room. Where airplanes of the era were noisy, turbulent, and limited in endurance, the Zeppelin could glide for days in near silence. The Zeppelin circumnavigation therefore demonstrated not just endurance, but a vision of global travel far in advance of conventional aviation. In 1931, the Graf Zeppelin further proved its technological prowess by undertaking a daring 6-day voyage to the Arctic. Here it stayed airborne for 136 hours of continuous flight, drifting above the frozen seas and the ice caps of the North Pole. On board were German and Soviet scientists who gathered data on ice, weather, and ocean currents, and, on their safe return, journalists hailed the success of the Great Silver Ship above the Arctic ice. The expedition proved that the Graf Zeppelin could operate successfully in polar conditions, something that again, fixed-wing aircraft could not do, and it also expanded the vision of what the airship could be, not just a palace for travellers, but a floating laboratory, carrying human curiosity into the last great wilderness of the earth. Therefore, for a brief period, The Zeppelin was revolutionary and decades ahead of its time. Its continual success in the early 1930s seemed to promise a future where continents would be joined together not only by ships and railways, but by great silver airships drifting high above the clouds. But what was also remarkable about the Graf Zeppelin, and often forgotten thanks to future events, was its safety record. Whilst there's no doubt that airships in other countries had gained a reputation for disaster, the German Zeppelins told a completely different story. From the mid-1920s until the mid-1930s, they were among the safest means of long-distance travel. In total, the Graf Zeppelin alone carried more than 34,000 passengers, crossed oceans hundreds of times, and flew over 1 million miles without a single passenger fatality. Indeed, as well as the absence of fatal crashes, actually any incidents at all involving the Graf Zeppelin were a rarity. In 1929, the loss of 4 engines forced an emergency landing in France. In 1930, a hailstorm damaged her envelope, and she briefly lost lift. And on her maiden transatlantic voyage in 1928, riggers had to repair the tail fin while still in flight. But beyond this, the incident record is remarkably sparse. Indeed, for nearly a decade, the Zeppelin was anything but the symbol of danger that we know it to be today. It was a thing of majesty and wonder, and the German airships offered something astonishing: comfort, reliability, and safety. It seemed that the dream of crossing oceans in palaces of the sky had been realized. But all of that would change in May 1937, when the Graf Zeppelin successor, the largest airship ever built, would undo the reputation of the entire industry in a single moment of fire and spectacle. Its name was the Hindenburg. The Hindenburg was the largest airship ever built. A silver giant more than 800 feet long, longer than 3 football fields placed end to end. At 135 feet across, it was wider than most cathedrals, and its vast gas cells contained almost twice the volume of the Graf Zeppelin. Where the Graf Zeppelin carried barely 20 passengers in simple bunks, the Hindenburg could accommodate over 50 in comfort. She offered large promenades with windows overlooking the clouds, dining rooms laid with white tablecloths, furniture inspired by Bauhaus principles, and cabins that promised the ease of an ocean liner in the sky. This was not merely an improvement, it was the greatest airship ever constructed, the pinnacle of an entire age of lighter-than-air travel, and, for over a year, it looked as though the ascendancy of this form of air travel was a certainty. Indeed, prior to May 1937, the Hindenburg was seen as a highly competent airship. In the year before her loss, the Hindenburg had completed 62 successful flights across the Atlantic, between Germany, Brazil, and the United States. She had carried more than 1,000 passengers safely, travelled over 200,000 miles, and had become the flagship of a new era in luxury travel. She was fast proving herself as a worthy successor to the Graf Zeppelin. But things were about to change in one disastrous instant. On the evening of the 6th of May 1937, the Hindenburg approached Lakehurst Naval Air Station in New Jersey, completing her 63rd voyage in what was the first Atlantic crossing of the new season. A storm had delayed her landing, and now the great ship circled, waiting for clearance. Below, hundreds of spectators gathered to watch her arrival, journalists, photographers, and families eager to see the silver giant descend. At 7:25 p.m., the Hindenburg began her final approach. Mooring lines were dropped to the ground. Passengers gathered their belongings, preparing to disembark after 3 days of smooth flight from Frankfurt. From below, she looked serene, gliding down with the grace that had made her famous. Then, in an instant, serenity turned to catastrophe. A spark ignited the hydrogen within her vast gas cells. Flames leapt across her hull with terrifying speed. In less than 40 seconds, the largest airship in the world was consumed in fire. The silver giant fell in a blazing collapse. Out of the 97 people on board, 36 lives were lost. 22 crew, 13 passengers, and 1 man on the ground who was helping her land. The images of the Hindenburg disaster were carried across the world. The burning frame, the collapsing hull, the stunned survivors, and the crackling voice of the radio reporter crying out, "Oh, the humanity!" What had taken decades to build, trust, glamour, the dream of peaceful flight, ended in a single moment of fire at Lakehurst. The concept of safe, silent luxury was replaced with the notion of a floating death trap. And just like that, the dream died. The precise cause of the Hindenburg disaster has been argued about ever since that night. The US Department of Commerce led the official investigation, with German engineers from the Zeppelin company also taking part. Witnesses were called, made up of surviving passengers, crew, and members of the ground team at Lakehurst. After weeks of hearings, the American inquiry concluded that the most likely cause was a hydrogen leak near the ship's bow, ignited by a static discharge as the charged skin of the airship met the wet mooring lines below. German officials accepted this explanation, but they saw it as a result of unusual conditions on the night rather than an inherent flaw in the design of their airship. And the rumours of sabotage that swirled around in the press were firmly rejected by both parties. Other theories would emerge in the years that followed. Some argued the Hindenburg's fabric coating, a mixture of cellulose, aluminium, and iron oxide, was itself highly flammable. Later experiments showed that while the fabric may well have contributed, it was the ship's reliance on hydrogen that doomed her. But interestingly, the Hindenburg had never been intended to fly with hydrogen. From the beginning, her engineers had designed her vast gas cells to hold helium, a safe, non-flammable lifting gas. Indeed, they had been redesigned to help compensate for the slightly lower lift helium provided, and the Zeppelin company's safety plan had been calling for the gas for some time. They knew the dangers of hydrogen all too well. They had seen smaller airships destroyed by fire in previous decades, and they were determined that their new flagship, the largest airship ever built, would be as safe as possible. But there was a problem. In the 1930s, the only nation in the world with helium reserves large enough to regularly fill an airship was the United States, which controlled its production from natural gas fields in Texas. By American law, helium was considered a strategic resource and could not be exported, least of all to Nazi Germany. And so, despite its design, the Hindenburg was forced to take to the skies filled with hydrogen, a gas everyone knew was dangerously flammable. The decision was a compromise to allow the Hindenburg to take flight at all, but it was also a fatal one. The Hindenburg's death was therefore not only an accident of weather or a spark, it was a tragedy born of politics, scarcity, and necessity, a ship designed with safety in mind, but ultimately doomed by circumstance. In the wake of Lakehurst, the Zeppelin dream collapsed almost overnight. Passenger flights were cancelled within weeks. The Graf Zeppelin, after nearly a decade of safe service, was retired. Her unfinished sister ship, Graf Zeppelin II, flew only as a propaganda vessel. She never carried a paying passenger. The Zeppelin company dismantled all its great airships by 1940. Their aluminium skeletons were melted down for the German war effort. Across the world, the age of the airship ended in silence. What had once seemed a vision of the future became a cautionary memory. Air travel did not die, of course. It shifted to the airplane. Within a generation, heavier-than-air machines were crossing oceans faster than any Zeppelin could dream. Speed triumphed over serenity. The Palace became the airliner. In the modern age, airship technology did not carry passengers or cargo, and has been mostly relegated to the role of static blimps whose once majestic silver skin is now adorned with products and advertising. Perhaps this will change in the future, but it is currently a mere shadow of its former glory, when airships ruled the skies. But what of you, traveller? Do you think the loss of the airships is a tragedy for the modern age? If helium had been the fuel of the future, could these giants of the sky have carried the millions who now cross oceans each year in cramped metal cabins? Could we have built a world where flight was slower, quieter, more graceful, and far less bound to the burning of oil? Perhaps the answer will never be known. But if you stand beneath the night sky and look up into the clouds, you may yet imagine it. a vast silver shape drifting in silence, lanterns glowing in the windows, a palace moving across the heavens. The dream that was the Zeppelin spectacularly burnt, but it was once glorious, even if only for a whisper in time.